Welcome to the Macmillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is David Atkin, Assistant Professor of Economics. His primary fields are trade and development. Professor Atkin's research focuses on evaluating the impacts of trade liberalization on the poor in the developing world. Today we'll talk with Professor Atkin about his work on rug exporting in Egypt and manufacturing soccer balls in Pakistan. Welcome, Professor Atkin.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with the rug exporting in Egypt. Tell us about the project.
Okay, so the initial motivation for this project was I guess there are three actually separate motivations. So firstly, there's been a lot of work in recent years trying to think of the supply constraints that affect small firms in developing countries and prevent them from growing. Things such as credit or lack of skills. But there's been very little work which looks at demand constraints. So by demand constraints, I mean if you're in a very small local market, there is not a very large number of buyers for your product, and that may mean you're not able to operate at large scale, for example. So that's sort of the first motivation, to try and understand if these demand constraints are really binding for these small firms. Secondly, and sort of perpendicular to that motivation, is there's a very large literature in international trade which tries to think about whether there's a link between trade and productivity, with many people hypothesizing that when you start, say, exporting to foreign countries, that your productivity may actually rise because you're learning things through this process of exporting. For example, the buyers provide you with information on how to better manufacture your products, and that may actually have a causal impact on your firm's productivity. Unfortunately, there's a second channel which goes in the opposite direction, which is we think it's the most productive firms who are the ones who are able to export. And this means it's often hard to tell apart whether or not actually the act of exporting changes your productivity rather than just better and more productive firms exporting. And so the sort of second motivation is to try and sort of tease out that causal channel, whether or not actually exporting itself leads to changes in productivity. And the third motivation is much more policy focused, which is vast amounts of money in recent years have been put into various aid for trade programs, where the idea is that trade can actually be a method of alleviating poverty in developing countries, but there's been no rigorous evaluation of any of these programs. And so the aim was to also provide such an evaluation.
Okay.
So what we're trying to do is we're trying to understand exactly the impacts that exporting has on our small producers and their incomes and their levels of poverty. And so in order to do this, we were looking for a context in the developing world where we would be able to generate some exogenous variation exporting. And what I mean by exogenous variation exporting is we need to generate some ability to control which firms were able to export and which firms weren't, in order for us to actually say that exporting leads to changes in income or changes in productivity. And so we partnered with a NGO based in Hartford, right near to here, called Aid to Artisans, and their methodology was to go into go work with small producers in developing countries and try and bring their products to Western markets through trade fairs, through the contacts they have within the industry. And working with them, we highlighted Egypt as a particularly a good location to do this, since they were about to start a large project there, and there were many firms of the type we were interested in.
Okay.
So we went to Egypt, and we eventually located a very large cluster of rug producers in sort of halfway between Alexandria and Cairo. And we've been working with them, and the essential idea is that there's several hundred producers in that town, and half of them we've given the opportunity to export their products to Western markets.
So 350?
So there's approximately 300 we've been working with initially, and in a second round we've been working with another 140. So the way we've been giving these firms an opportunity to export is we've managed to, through these trade fairs, etc., secure a large number of orders from Western firms in in places like Germany and in the US. For example, ABC Carpets and Home in New York. And these companies have been ordering various designs of rugs, and we're working with an intermediary in Egypt, and those opportunities to produce those rugs for export have been allocated to a subset of those firms we're working with and not allocated to the other subset. And we've been choosing which firms get this opportunity at random, and this enables us to tease out what's the impact of being provided with this opportunity to export.
So what have you found? I know it's ongoing research, but have you made any, what have you found to this point?
So we're still at a reasonably early stage. We're expecting to have our final results in a few months. But so far the results are very promising. A few things stand out. So the first thing that is most apparent is there have been dramatic changes in quality, in the quality of the rugs which these small firms are producing.
And why do you think that is?
So we've looked into this in quite a lot of depth, and so we sort of have a fairly good handle on exactly what's going on, which is sort of valuable. There's a large literature in trade which tests hypotheses that trade changes the quality levels, particularly if you're exporting to richer Western countries. But we don't know so much about the sort of nitty-gritty details of how that occurs. So in our case, we have very, very good survey data, and the technology is quite easy for us to understand, so we can actually see exactly what's going on. So to give you some examples,
yes.
When you sell rugs in the local market, the domestic market in Egypt, you're a rug producer, and they ask for, say, a 9x6 rug. Then you'll make one that's, say, maybe 8x5, and then the next one you'll make 10x6, and you'll say, oh, it's about right, it's fine, let's just run with that. So if you're selling to a Western retailer of rugs, every rug has to be exactly 9x6. A lot of the purchasers, particularly the rugs going to Germany, are interior designers. And they don't want a rug that's actually 10x6 when they open it up, even though they thought it was 9x6. Similarly, they don't want a rug which, when they ordered lime green, turns out to be a different shade of green.
Right. So that's interesting. So it's kind of a cultural thing almost, where if you're producing for your native country, it's okay to have it not be exact, but they know, the producers, the manufacturers of the rugs know that is unacceptable. To produce.
So there's various reasons why this might be. So sort of one simple reason was if they're purchasing in markets in the developing countries, and there's sort of no repeated interactions. And so if this rug's not quite the right size and you bring it home, you're not going to not purchase another rug from that person because you weren't going to purchase another rug from them anyway.
Right.
While the rug dealers in the United States, if they get a return on their rug at ABC Carpet and Home, they're not going to keep on ordering from you when the customer complains. So that could be also what's going on. So that's the sort of first thing. Another thing is if you have a rug like this rug here, it lies very flat. So this isn't a hand-woven rug, but when you hand-weave rugs, it takes a lot of effort to make sure the rug lies flat. It involves more sort of a constant level of care to make sure every knot is particularly tight. And we've seen sort of fairly dramatic increases in how flat these rugs lie when they're being produced for export. And we sort of understand the processes of how that's occurring. There's feedback coming from the buyer saying these things are not acceptable, and then responses from the producers. So that's sort of one dimension. We're finding these large changes in quality. The other dimension that's particularly important, I think, in the Egyptian context is when we started this project, we weren't able to properly anticipate the Arab Spring. I guess we weren't alone in that. But actually, by the time we started our baseline, the events had already started to unfold. And what that's meant is this is an extremely volatile time in Egypt, and the domestic demand has been very low. A lot of the domestic demand actually comes from tourists who are visiting Egypt, purchasing a pretty rug with a picture of the Sphinx on it. Those guys are no longer turning up in large numbers. And so what we're seeing, which is a sort of standard prediction of a trade model, is if you're able to export to many countries, and countries sometimes are hit with these shocks, which leads the local demand to be low, then you're going to be protected through your exports.
Right.
And so what we're seeing is the volatility of these guys who are exporting's income is much lower. So they're more able to eat meat on a month-to-month basis, which is a sort of nice, a clean indicator of how wealthy they are, given that they're eating meat approximately once to twice a month, and those numbers go up reasonably dramatically when they get more income. And so essentially what we hypothesize is going on here is your ability to sell to these other markets where they don't have the same fluctuations in demand, means you're able to sort of smooth out these events. Obviously, we're looking at a fairly extreme one of these events, which is the sort of revolution in Egypt, which has very much disrupted the domestic market. So while the results are preliminary, we are seeing increases in income, reductions in the volatility of income, and also increases in quality levels and such things for these small producers of rugs.
So one of the outcomes for you personally must have been you learned a lot about making rugs and the rug business, I would imagine.
I certainly know more than I did before I went into the project.
Yes, okay. And then are there any implications at this point that you can point to? Well,
so I'm reluctant to commit to any implications before we have our final results, but it seems if these early results carry through into the longer run, that there is some benefits of these aid for trade type programs in alleviating poverty, for one, and that's potentially desirable. For example, rather than concentrating on, say, an intervention which is designed to give greater access to credit for small firms, we may think about an intervention that's designed to improve access to larger markets for firms. Maybe not just access to foreign markets, but also access to the capital city market if you're in a remote area. And these types of programs may actually be very effective, and we should sort of investigate those types of programs more.
Okay, very good. Now let's go on to the work you did in Pakistan with soccer balls. Let's talk about that project.
So this is a timely interview. Today the World Cup soccer ball was announced. To great fanfare, so soccer balls are on the world's mind.
Let me ask you, are most of the world's soccer balls made in Pakistan?
So historically, yes. China has been surging recently. And we think at present approximately 40% of the world's soccer balls are made in Pakistan. But
that was surprising for me to learn. I had no idea. And I never would have picked Pakistan, frankly.
What's amazing about that is not just the quantity of soccer balls, but they're all made in one town. As well. And this industry goes back to the 1890s, in fact, when a British sergeant asked a local Pakistani saddle producer to repair his soccer ball when he was stationed in Punjab. And the saddle maker said, I'll make you another soccer ball if you want. And the rest was history. So they have a very large soccer ball industry. They sort of dominate one particular segment, which is the hand-stitched soccer balls. China has now taken a lot of the machine-stitched market, which is sort of cheaper, lower-quality soccer balls in general. So in this project, it's sort of a quite different tack. Rather than looking at these small rug producers who are 1, 2, 3, 4 person firms, we're looking at some very large firms. The largest has 2,200 employees. And so these are large producers in the town of Sialkot in Punjab. And the sort of question here was we were trying to understand both the process of technology adoption as well as how technology spread between firms. And the reason why this is an interesting question is, firstly, if you're interested in increasing innovation or productivity, then technology is obviously a key part of that. But also a lot of industrial policies that governments put in place are predicated on the fact that there are sort of spillovers between firms. And so if they, for example, subsidize the technology for one firm, it will then spill over to other firms in the country, and that actually justifies subsidizing it in the first place. because it's possible the firm itself wouldn't want to pay for that, given that many of the benefits are going to the other firms rather than just themselves. So, so in particular, what we've been looking for is we were thinking, as with the Egypt project, we needed some place to try and investigate this phenomenon. And what we wanted to do was we wanted to see if we introduced a new technology, what would happen. Would people adopt that technology? And if they adopted it, how would it spread within sort of the networks of firms in a cluster? So it came to our attention that there was this large cluster of soccer balls manufacturers in Sialkot, and we sort of investigated further, and we thought that this was actually a sort of fertile cluster for us to contemplate an innovation. And so the sort of history behind the innovation is somewhat interesting. We initially hired a consultant who'd previously worked in the soccer ball industry and asked him if he could come up with some sort of innovation that could, say, reduce costs, and then we could think about handing this to a subset of the firms in a random manner.
Well, that's pretty amazing.
And he failed, unfortunately.
Oh.
He didn't take the money we offered him. He went down and he tried. But he'd previously innovated in the cutting technology they use to cut the pentagons and hexagons that you form together to make a bull. And so that set our minds thinking, and one of my co-authors, Eric Verhoeven, was doing a little bit of industrial espionage on YouTube, looking at a sort of promotional video for the production of the 2000 and I guess it was the 2006 World Cup ball. Or
I would have no idea.
I'm forgetting.
It's okay though. So what did he find?
And in the video for how they produced that bull, they showed them cutting a sheet of pentagons using a very different pattern of cuts to the one that he'd seen when he had recently visited Sialkot. And he thought maybe we can do better than they're currently doing. And it turns out that the way they were cutting pentagons in Sialkot was the same way that they were cutting hexagons, which is essentially you take a pentagon shape and you put it next to another pentagon shape, and then you on its a flush on its side, and then you stamp down, stamp down, stamp down. And if you do that with a hexagon, then you fill a plane, you tessellate a plane, because you can perfectly fit hexagons into each other in order to fill a rectangle, for example. Now you can't do that with pentagons, but they were using the sort of same design that they had for the hexagons. So it turns out there's a better design for pentagons where you sort of rotate the two dies slightly, so you can get more pentagons onto a plane.
So you're not wasting any material.
Right, and the reason why this is important is these material costs, which is essentially an artificial leather that they make, which is what they're cutting the panels out of, is approximately 50% of the total costs. So any reduction in wastage actually hits their bottom line. So Eric and his wife, who's an architect, sort of tried to take what they saw on the video and implement it into a design, and we then sort of brought this technology to Sialkot and tried it out. We got some dies made, and indeed we were able to obtain between, say, 6 and 10% more pentagons per sheet when you used this altered die compared to the traditional die. And so that corresponds to approximately 1 or 1.5% cost reduction. So that doesn't sound like an enormous amount, but the sort of median profits of these firms are about 8%. And so that's a significant chunk, 10-15% of their profits. And so this is sort of a desirable innovation. So we basically went and provided this technology, both the dies and the design and an explanation on how to use it, to a random subset of firms.
So what happened?
And so the idea was actually twofold. Was first we wanted to see if they took up the technology, and conditional on taking up the technology, we wanted to see how this technology spread across firms within the town. So we collected very, very detailed information on networks between owners, between workers, where they purchased their supplies from, if they had ethnic ties, etc. and the idea was to try and map these information flows. So what has happened up to this point is that there has been some adoption of the dye, but sort of far less adoption than we initially anticipated, given our cost calculations, which suggested that this was really a beneficial technology.
And why do you think that is?
So one hypothesis is that the technology is actually not that effective. So we don't think that's true, and the reason is approximately 11, I think 10 or 11 firms have adopted the technology, and one firm in particular, who's one of the largest firms in town, has actually purchased 37 of these dyes sequentially. So if the technology wasn't any good, maybe you'd buy one of them and then decide, oh, this doesn't work. But they've basically moved most of their production over to this new cutting method, and this is a sort of leading firm. So it's clear that when properly adopted, this technology seems to be profitable. So this was a bit of a puzzle, so we sort of inquired further. And sort of one interesting dimension is this firm, which I just mentioned, they were a bit different to almost every other firm in the town in that, in general, these cutters who are actually asked to use the dye and stamp out these shapes are paid using piece rates. So they're paid per ball that they cut, essentially.
Okay.
But in this firm, they were paid a fixed wage. So you're paid for the hours you turn up to work. And we heard, and we did a small sort of qualitative survey, that the main reason firms weren't adopting was because there was a lot of resistance from their cutters as well as their printers. And so we sort of thought about this some more, and then we realized that what we hypothesize is going on is if you're being paid piece rate, i.e. per ball, and your boss says, here's a new technology, please start using this technology, it's going to save the firm money. It's not going to save the cutter any money, since he doesn't care how much wastage there is, he's just paid per ball. But what it is going to do is it's going to slow him down. He has to sort of change the way he moves his hands in order to move these dyes across. He has to learn, he has to be more careful initially because it's sort of harder to get this shape that you've never done before on this new shape, on this new, using this new dye. And so essentially he's going to sort of be slowed down as he has to learn how to adapt the new technology, how to use it.
So there's a learning curve.
So there's a learning curve. And while he learns, he gets paid less. And when he gets up to speed, he doesn't get any more. And so it sort of struck us that, of course, these guys would be resisting and potentially also misinforming their owners, the owners of the firms, about exactly how effective this technology was, since they didn't have any desire to
adopt it,
to take this sort of hit as they learned how to use it. So we were sort of intrigued by this idea. So actually right now in the field we have a sort of a complementary experiment where we've taken the firms who we previously provided technology with, and a random subset of them we've actually turned up and we've attempted to offer what we think is a more effective wage contract to their workers. In effect, we're paying them a sort of fixed wage for 1 month.
So they come up to speed with the learning curve and figure out how to do it.
And so they're not taking this sort of hit initially. And what we're hoping to find, and very, very preliminary results are encouraging, is that this will spur significant adoption. And so what's sort of quite interesting about this is, and somewhat unexpected, is it implies that there are sort of these organizational barriers to technology adoption. And those are when the incentives of the owners and the workers who actually have to use the technology are misaligned. And this can be because of sort of the structure of wage contracts within the firm. And so in terms of the implications, obviously this is extremely preliminary, but should governments want to encourage technology adoption, you may also need to encourage the use of incentive mechanisms within organizations which ensure that these technologies will be successfully adopted, which often goes beyond simply rewarding the CEO with some sort of subsidy, but may also involve having some mechanism such that the workers down the line are not sort of adversely affected during the adoption period.
Very good. I am curious, rugs, soccer balls, how do you go about choosing the industry, so to speak?
Well, so in the rugs case, we weren't particularly set on rugs vis-a-vis other products that were made for export. The way we ended up choosing rugs were, as I mentioned, we chose Egypt because the sort of partner organization we were working with was going into Egypt. It seemed like an ideal setting. It was sort of a clean slate for them. And we actually didn't initially choose rugs. The first industry we chose was bed sheets. So we spoke to firms, and at the same time, as we were sort of setting things up on the ground, the NGO was attempting to drum up orders and interest in these Egyptian-made bed sheets on in Western markets, at trade fairs, etc. And there simply wasn't interest. The Indians were charging approximately half the price that the Egyptian producers could sell at, and people actually preferred the Indian product.
Wow.
And so we ended up with rugs as a sort of second try, and actually if you look at the literature, the second try was actually not bad, since this organization has approximately a 30% success rate, so approximately 1 out of every 3 industries they try and go into, they're able to actually generate sort of sustained orders, and this sort of matches up with generally most exporters don't succeed. They try and export and then they pull back, and only a few firms which become very big successful exporters actually do succeed. So so rugs was our second shot. The nice thing about rugs is these are sort of flat weave, hand woven rugs. There is a sort of a sentiment in Western markets that the Middle East is a top producer of these rugs, which is perhaps not the view of bedspreads, where the Indians seem to be far more successful. So I think sort of a combination of this is a sort of comparative advantage industry in the Middle East, and they were able to produce high quality products at a reasonably cheap price. There were a variety of other industries which didn't suit our requirements quite as well in terms of the industry structure, where there are lots of sort of small firms we could work with.
Very interesting.
Which we also dispatched.
And what about the soccer balls?
So the soccer balls
versus baseballs, for instance, you know.
So they don't make any baseballs in Sialkot. So what we were really looking for was a cluster where there were many firms located close to each other. That's why we think these sort of technology spillovers are going to be strongest and easiest to understand as well. And so I guess a question just popped up in my head. With the technology spillover, if I'm manufacturing soccer balls, wouldn't I want all of the business? I mean, wouldn't I not want the technology to spill over to other people? Oh, absolutely. So the firms, and these are large firms, have a strong incentive to protect the technology.
Okay.
However, having spoken to the firms now and seen the process that have occurred, even with the small number of spillovers that we've observed in the town, there's plenty of people who aren't so careful, such as some of the workers at the firms or the suppliers of the dyes, for example. And even though you're very secretive, you may well tell your brother-in-law, who also has a firm. So in a lot of these families, maybe there was a grandfather who had, or great-grandfather who started the firm, and then over the generations there are now multiple firms run by various members of the family, and they intermarry as well across firms. And so there are approximately 140 firms making soccer balls in Sialkot right now. So it's a large industry. And so there's a lot of these different channels, and in sort of the next project we're working on is to try and sort of start looking into that data and trying to understand the routes through which
the technology spreads.
These technologies do spread.
Right.
And that will also help policymakers say they want to know if they do want to subsidize some innovation, which firms are the ones which provide biggest bang for your buck, so to speak. as well as how large are these spillovers, what kind of industrial policies would they justify.
Okay, well, we'll look forward to seeing that from you. So thank you very much for being here with us today and sharing some of your work.
Thank you very much for having me.
For more information about Professor Atkin and his work, please visit our website at yale.edu/Macmillan Report. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the Macmillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.